Welcome to Storyverse, where stories speak and you learn English naturally. Chapter 1. The Strangers in the Diner. The evening light faded slowly over the quiet town of Summit. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows of Henry's lunchroom, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and leaves. Inside, everything was calm. George was behind the counter polishing a cup, and Nick Adams, a young helper with curious eyes, sat at the far end, chatting idly about nothing important. Then the bell above the door jingled. Two men stepped in. They were dressed exactly alike, dark overcoats buttoned tightly across their chests, derby hats pulled low, and black gloves still on their hands. Their faces were pale and expressionless, like masks carved from wax. Something about them didn't belong in that small, ordinary diner. They sat down at the counter without a word. "What'll it be?" George asked, trying to sound casual. The first man looked at the menu but didn't seem to read it. "I don't know," he said slowly. "What do you want to eat, Al?" The second man shrugged. "I don't know. I don't know what I want to eat." George forced a polite smile. "You can have sandwiches, ham and eggs, bacon and eggs. Whatever you like." "I'll take ham and eggs," said the one called Al. "Bacon and eggs," said the other. George turned toward the kitchen window and called the order. But when he looked back, he noticed something strange. Both men were still wearing their gloves. They leaned on the counter, staring ahead with cold, empty eyes. "What have you got to drink?" Al asked. "Ginger ale, root beer—" "I mean real drinks?" Al interrupted. "Nothing like that," George replied. "Just soft drinks." "This town's a hot one," said the other man. "What's it called again?" "Summit," George answered. "Ever hear of it, Al?" "No," Al said. "Guess nobody has." They laughed softly, the kind of laugh that doesn't sound like laughter at all. Nick shifted uneasily on his stool. He didn't know why, but the air inside the diner suddenly felt heavier. A few minutes later, the tone of their voices changed. The jokes stopped. The first man looked at George and said flatly, "All right, bright boy. You and your cook are going to do just what we tell you. We're waiting for someone." George frowned. "Waiting for who?" "For a guy named Ole Anderson," Al said. "He eats here every night at 6 o'clock." Nick's heart jumped. He knew Ole, a tall, quiet man who used to box in Chicago and now lived nearby. George tried to stay calm. "What are you going to do to him?" "Nothing," Al said. "Just a little business for a friend." Within moments, the situation changed. Al moved toward the kitchen with a short, sawed-off shotgun hidden beneath his coat. The other man, Max, stayed by the counter, keeping his eyes on George and Nick. They made Nick and the cook, Sam, go into the kitchen. Al tied their hands with towels and shoved them into the corner. "Don't move, bright boy," he hissed. Nick sat trembling, hearing only the ticking of the clock and the faint murmur of Max's voice from the other room. Time slowed. 5 minutes felt like 50. Every sound, a clink of a cup, the wind outside, the soft hum of the refrigerator, echoed like thunder. Ole Anderson was supposed to arrive at 6. It was already 5:30. Nick's mind raced. What if Ole walked in? What if the killers were telling the truth? He could almost picture Ole's tall figure stepping through the door, unaware of the two men waiting to end his life. Then, through the small window between the kitchen and counter, Nick saw George glancing nervously at the clock. He wasn't moving, wasn't speaking. He was just waiting. Outside, the sun had disappeared. The street lamp flickered on, spilling a faint yellow glow across the glass window. The two strangers didn't eat their food. They didn't even touch it. They were waiting for death to walk through the door. And in that silent little diner, the smell of fried eggs, the ticking of the wall clock, and the fear in three men's eyes, time stood perfectly still. Chapter 2. Waiting for Ole Anderson. The clock on the diner wall ticked louder than ever before. Outside, night had settled completely, pressing its shadowed weight against the glass window. The street was almost empty. Only the hum of a passing car, the flicker of a street lamp, and the faint sound of footsteps fading into silence. Inside Henry's lunchroom, time seemed frozen. George stood stiffly behind the counter. Max sat across from him, calm and cold, staring at the reflection in the mirror behind the bar. His small, sharp face looked even paler under the yellow light. Al's voice drifted faintly from the kitchen where he guarded Nick and the cook, Sam. Every now and then, Max would glance at the clock. It was 6:15, then 20 minutes, then past. He smiled without warmth. "Guess your friend's running late, bright boy." George said nothing. His hands rested on the counter, steady but pale. "You know," Max continued, "it's funny. Towns like this, people don't expect things to happen. They eat their dinner, talk about the weather, go home to bed. But sometimes something bad comes in the door, and they don't even see it coming." His eyes stayed on George's reflection. The words felt like ice. From the kitchen came the muffled sound of Al laughing. "Bright boy's nice and quiet now," he said. "Maybe we ought to keep him as company." "Don't talk so much," Max replied without turning. "You always talk too much." The minutes dragged on. A streetcar rattled past outside, its shadow sliding across the wall. A man entered briefly, asking for supper, but George quickly said, "The cook's out. Come back later." His voice didn't tremble, but his eyes did. The man left, unaware he had just stepped into the edge of something deadly. At exactly 7 o'clock, the door still hadn't opened. Max checked his watch, sighed, and muttered, "He's not coming." "Give him 5 more minutes," Al called from the kitchen. So they waited again. 5 long, endless minutes. Then Max stood, brushing crumbs from his coat. "Let's go," he said. "We've wasted enough time." Al stepped out from the kitchen, the bulge of a sawed-off shotgun hidden under his coat. He adjusted his gloves, glanced once at George, and smirked. "You got a lot of luck, bright boy," he said. "Yeah," Max added. "You ought to play the races. Maybe you'll win something before someone else loses." The two men stepped outside, crossing under the streetlight, their shadows stretching long and thin across the pavement. They looked like a vaudeville act. 2 dark clowns walking out of a bad dream. Then they were gone. Silence returned, but it wasn't peace. George hurried into the kitchen, untied Nick and Sam. Nick's face was pale, his eyes wide. Sam muttered something under his breath, a prayer, maybe, or a curse. "I don't want any more of that," the cook said, shaking his head. "Not ever again." George looked at the clock. 7:10. The ticking seemed louder now, as if mocking them all. "They were gonna kill Ole Anderson," George said quietly. Nick swallowed hard. "We gotta tell him?" "Yeah," George nodded, "before they find him first." The 3 men stood in the empty diner, the smell of cold eggs still hanging in the air, the echo of those 2 strangers still alive in the silence. Outside, The wind pressed against the glass again, and somewhere in the darkness, death was still waiting. Chapter 3. A Man Who Stopped Running. Nick Adams walked quickly through the cold, quiet streets. The night air felt heavier after what had happened at the diner. The lamps flickered dimly, stretching long shadows across the sidewalks. His heart was pounding, not from fear for himself, but for Ole Anderson. He had to warn him before those two men returned. The boarding house was at the end of the street, an old gray building that looked forgotten by time. Its narrow windows glowed faintly with a pale yellow light. Nick climbed the wooden stairs, each step creaking beneath his weight. When he knocked, a tired woman opened the door. Her voice was low and cautious as she said, "Mr. Anderson's upstairs? Room 12." Nick nodded and went up. The hallway smelled of dust and dampness. When he reached the door, he paused. For a moment, he thought of turning back, but then he knocked gently. "Come in," a voice said. Inside, Ole Anderson lay fully dressed on the bed, staring at the ceiling. His massive shoulders filled the small room, but his eyes seemed empty, as if the fight had already left him long ago. He didn't look surprised to see Nick. Nick hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Anderson," he said softly, "two men were at Henry's lunchroom. They were waiting for you. They said they were going to kill you." Ole turned his head slightly, his expression calm, almost tired. "I know," he said. "There's nothing to do about it." Nick was startled. Then why don't you get out of town?" Ole gave a slow, weary sigh. "There's no use. I'm through with running." His voice was low and steady, like a man who had already accepted his fate. "I got in wrong with some people a long time ago. I've been expecting this for a while." For a moment, Nick didn't know what to say. He looked around the room. A pair of old boxing gloves hung on the wall, their leather cracked and faded. On the dresser sat a photograph of Ole in his prime, smiling, confident, standing tall in the ring. That man was gone now, replaced by someone who had made peace with the inevitable. Nick tried again. "But you can't just wait here. You can tell the police or—" Ole shook his head. "No police. It won't make any difference. I just want to stay here and wait." Nick stood there in silence. The ticking of a clock on the table was the only sound in the room. Each second felt heavier than the last. Finally, Nick nodded slowly. "All right," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." Ole didn't answer. He just turned his face back toward the ceiling, the faint light casting deep shadows across his face. Nick could tell the man had already said goodbye to life long before that night. When Nick left the room, the woman at the front desk looked up at him. "Did you see him?" she asked. "Yes," Nick replied softly. "He's not going to do anything." She sighed. "I guess he's been waiting for it to happen." Nick stepped outside. The cold air bit into his face. The town was quiet again. Too quiet. He walked back to the diner, his mind heavy with the image of Ole lying motionless on the bed. George was still behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag that had seen better days. He looked up when Nick entered. "Did you find him?" Nick nodded. "Yeah, he knows about it. He's not going to do anything." George stopped wiping for a moment, staring at the counter as if trying to make sense of it all. "That's a tough man," he said finally. Nick didn't answer. The silence between them said more than words ever could. Outside, the wind howled faintly, pushing against the diner windows. After a while, Nick said quietly, "I'm going to get out of this town, George. I don't want to think about it anymore. George nodded slowly. I don't blame you. Nick looked out the window one last time. The streets were empty, the neon lights flickering faintly over the diner sign. Somewhere in the darkness, two men were still waiting, and a tired boxer lay in his room, waiting for his end. As Nick walked away into the cold night, he realized something he would never forget. That some people don't die when their hearts stop beating. They die when they stop fighting. And old Anderson had stopped long ago. The snow began to fall softly, covering the streets in silence, erasing the footprints of the night's fear, as if the world itself wanted to forget what had happened.